Always true.
In a time marked by escalating tensions across regions, military alliances are being tested. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO, is the world's largest military alliance, established in the aftermath of the Second World War to guarantee collective security among its member states and to counter the threat of the then Soviet Union. But NATO is now looking to strengthen partnerships beyond Europe and North America. Its leading military official, Admiral Rob Bauer, is visiting Qatar, a nation outside the alliance but home to one of the Middle East's most strategically important US military bases. His visit comes as Donald Trump has been re-elected, a presidency that has historically challenged NATO's unity and funding commitments. So what does this re-election mean for the alliance? And with conflicts in Gaza and Lebanon, does NATO have a role to play? Admiral Rob Bauer, chair of NATO's military committee, talks to Al Jazeera. Admiral Rob Bauer, thank you for talking to Al Jazeera. You are here in Qatar on a visit. We're going to discuss that a little later, but during tumultuous times in the region, I have a lot I want to talk with you about, but I think there's only one way we can start this interview, considering the events of the last couple of days. And
let me guess. Okay.
Let me just give it context, and then, because interestingly, I was reading a paper, policy paper, where it quoted NATO members, unnamed, obviously not you, but saying that some hope within NATO that the Trump presidency, the past one, was simply an aberration that will not be repeated. What does Donald Trump's re-election mean for NATO?
I think it is important to say that before the election results were known, I said a number of things, and I will basically repeat them. And that is that the elections in the United States is a thing of the American people. And they have chosen a new president, and that is President Trump. So it's a fact. So I think it is most important now that we focus on how to work with President Trump and his team when they come into office in January 2025. And one of the things that happened during his first term as president was that he was very clear on the fact that he didn't like the fact that a lot of nations in the alliance didn't spend enough money on their own armed forces. And that is the famous 2% discussion. It is not money for someone else. It is money for your own armed forces to become stronger, because the NATO treaty says two things. One is you need to be able to defend yourself. That's Article 3. And then the famous article everybody knows is Article 5, that if some ally is in trouble, then the rest will come to rescue or to help you. Now, if all of us are able to defend ourselves, all the nations are able to defend themselves, then it is much easier to help a nation that is attacked. So his irritation, and he was not the first president irritated about this, that a lot of nations did not invest enough in their own armed forces, and basically, without saying it, expected the United States to come to the rescue. And that is a very legitimate irritation, to be honest. And so what the alliance has done, partly as a result of what he asked at the time, was that now 6 times more nations have reached the 2% target. And so 23 out of the 32 nations now have reached the 2%, a minimum of 2%. So they spend 2% or more. So basically what we can do when he arrives in office in January 2025, we can say to him, Mr. President, in a pleasant way, we can say, we have basically done what you have asked, rightfully, of a lot of nations, and more nations have replied to this in a positive way by spending more on themselves. So I think in that sense, there is good news when it comes to the alliance. Second, if you look at the situation in the world, it is in the interest of the United States and, of course, the European nations and Canada to stick together in the alliance, in NATO, because in uncertain times like we are living in now, basically we need each other very much. And a stable Europe is important for North America, United States and Canada, and the other way around. Why? Because Europe is the first trading partner of the United States, so a stable and secure Europe is in the interest of the United States. And I don't expect that to change with a new president, to be honest. Secondly, as I said, more and more nations now basically do what they have promised, and there's still work to be done, to be honest, and that is probably where the discussion will focus on to start off with. But in many ways, the alliance has moved forward in a very positive way. That is basically the result of his first term. He showed very strong leadership in his first term as a president with regard to NATO, to basically encourage nations to do what they had promised.
The NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte actually gave him credit for that, saying that it was a lot down to that. Also, Ukraine happening, I think also woke a lot of European nations up, thinking that actually we may need to reassess our military situation.
It's not a theoretical thing, war, which might be thought by a number of nations. And it's not a theory. It's not a theoretical thing. It is a reality, unfortunately, that has come very, very close.
And I think you touched on a lot of points, actually. I wanted to ask you, you were talking about unity, which is so important. In an alliance that doesn't have a military, again, these are individual militaries, and you're united by an alliance, by a common goal, by unity. NATO was created 75 years ago as a security alliance, basically to counter the threat of the then Soviet Union.
Absolutely.
So if we look at the situation now with Ukraine, it is almost like the essence of the existence of NATO has come back, but in very different times. How would you describe that?
Yeah, basically it started not with the full-fledged invasion in 2022, but it started after the annexation of Crimea. We started to change our military plans to a threat-based military plan, which was not the case for many decades. So we said, basically there's two threats that we face as an alliance, Russia and terrorist organizations. And we based then all our military plans, first the strategies and then lower strategy and eventually the operational plans from the Joint Force Commanders, the regional plans that were approved in Vilnius in 2023. And all these plans basically look at how do you deter and defend against those two threats. So it is focused again on Russia. Now Russia, then the Soviet Union. So in a way, we have come back to collective defense. And it's always been one of the three tasks: collective defense, cooperative security, which is training and things like that, and the thing we did for many decades, which was crisis response operations, like in Afghanistan. So we have now come back to collective defense. We now focus again on defending ourselves, and through all these new plans and the threats that we have acknowledged and agreed upon, is that we now know basically what we have to do. We need more readier soldiers, because no longer time is on our side. With crisis response operations in another country, we decided whether we were going to participate in that conflict or not. Now, if you are attacked, then basically you need to be ready. And if you're not, then you have a serious problem, because in war there is no second place. So that is the realization that sunk in basically around 2019. So we started to work on that more and more, we made it more practical. We made sure that we understood we need more soldiers, as I said, at a higher readiness.
Is there an arms race going on now?
I think it's a misinterpretation of what is going on. I think what we have now done is to make sure that for the plans that we have, based upon an agreed threat, which is the size and the capabilities of the Russian armed forces. If they attack us, we now know what we need to do. Therefore, we know which capabilities we need, how many soldiers we need, the changes to command and control, all the things that we have done since, basically. And that leads to a conclusion that after 30 years of underinvestment in many, many nations, we now need to invest again in our ability to defend ourselves. This is not an arms race in the sense that we are making ourselves ready to attack anyone. This is making sure that we are able to defend ourselves against an agreed threat.
I want to touch on also something that the NATO Secretary General talked about last week, North Korea coming in to the fold, troops with Russia against Ukraine. He called this a deeply dangerous moment for the world.
Yeah. It is amazing that because Russia needed help in its war against Ukraine, basically they needed ammunition from that. It started with ammunition and missiles from North Korea and Iran, and now they have even asked for troops, and North Korean troops have been are being seen first in Russia and now the first troops in the Kursk region. Now, it's fascinating that one of the most isolated countries in the world, North Korea, is now sort of seeing itself part of the international community because it is allowed by Russia. Because suddenly Russia and also China no longer enforce the UN Security Council resolutions that were decided upon with the help of Russia and China on the nuclear weapons of North Korea, the ballistic missiles, so the whole arms race that is going on in North Korea itself against South Korea. So the fact that now, because Russia needs North Korea, they no longer stop North Korea becoming more and more dangerous. And I think that is what Secretary General Rutte was talking about, that it is very concerning that a nation that was so isolated now suddenly is out there playing a role, an important role for Russia.
When it comes to the military, even bringing in the nuclear issue, how much is deterrence and how much is a real threat to use what you have?
You mean nuclear?
Yes,
in general?
In general.
Yeah.
And I'm throwing nuclear in that in a very wide way, but like people will tell you that nuclear weapons is more about deterrence than actually using. How concerned should we be that nuclear could become real?
I would say in general, we have agreed amongst the states with nuclear weapons that a nuclear war should not be fought and actually cannot be won. If that taboo is broken by any of the nations with nuclear weapons, then we have a completely different discussion than we have until today. So that is very important to start off with. Secondly, the nuclear rhetoric we hear from Russia in the last 2.5 years is concerning, because it is not once, it is almost every week we now hear a discussion on the use of nuclear weapons. And if you would say to me, I will kick you, and you do that every week without doing that, that threat becomes...
Cry wolf.
That threat in itself becomes less threatening. Unfortunately, with nuclear weapons, if it happens, it might not happen, but if it happens, the effect is much larger than you kicking me. So, because that is the case, you have to take all these discussions in Russia very seriously. Because if it happens, the consequences are enormous. Now, until now, the Russian rhetoric and the things we see from Russia have not forced us to change our nuclear posture. So I think that is, for now, the situation.
You have extensive military experience in various different ways. If you look at, we've just described everything that's happening geopolitically with Russia, with the two blocs, let's say, that are merging. We will talk about your visit to Qatar coming up. We've seen tumultuous times in the Middle East, certainly over the last year and the last couple of months. How would you assess where we are right now in terms of how concerned should we be about what is happening around us?
I think if you bring it back to a very simple thing, what we see basically at the moment is the rebalancing of power in the world. And primarily, I would say, it is between the United States and China. And basically, because that is happening, other players now also see an opportunity, like North Korea, like Iran, but also Russia. And so, therefore, it is concerning if you see that those nations in particular, Russia, China, North Korea, and Iran, are working closer and closer together In the beginning it was only Russia and China. Now it is also North Korea and Russia, and basically China allowing North Korea to do that, which was in itself remarkable, that North Korea basically got the space to do this, becoming closer with Russia. And so I think that is basically let's say the cause of what is happening now. And therefore I think we will see for the next 15 years unrest. And if tectonic plates shift on Earth, you will have earthquakes. If tectonic plates of power shift, you will have wars. I'm not saying world wars, but you will have maybe regional wars, conflicts like what we see in Ukraine, where people think they can get away with breaking the rules. Russia violated the international rules-based order by attacking a sovereign state with internationally recognized borders. And China is, although they always talk about sovereignty and internationally recognized borders as a very important principle, they have not condemned Russia for attacking Ukraine. So we are in uncertain times in that sense, where the fact that the rules that all of us, including China and Russia, have agreed upon in the past decades are now breaking those rules.
You are here in the state of Qatar. It is not a member of NATO, but you were telling me earlier you've had relations since the early 2000s, 2009.
Qatar is a partner of NATO since 2005. NATO has in total 35 partners of nations around the world, basically, including, for example, Australia, New Zealand, Japan and South Korea, but also Colombia in South America, Mongolia, and a lot of nations in the Middle East and in North Africa. So it is it's a longer standing development in NATO that we work with, that we have partners. But I think the war in Ukraine has shown us that next to focusing on collective defense, which is basically defending ourselves better than we have been able to do in the last decades, we also need those relationships with the partners, because they are essential for understanding the conflicts in the different regions. Because, for example, Qatar has, of course, a very good understanding of the different players in the Middle East. And so if you discuss the situation in the Middle East with people, with the military and the political leadership of Qatar, you will get a better understanding. And that will help us to understand the conflicts that might have repercussions for us as NATO as well.
Has there been a focus on regional security, energy security, potentially in your visit here? New regional alliances, is this something that you could specifically tell us more about?
No, I would say the focus during my visit with the military committee has been on making sure that we understand what Qatar wants in the cooperation with NATO. And I think the message from the Minister of Defense and from the Qatar, the chief of the chief of the General Staff in Qatar is that they want to increase cooperation with NATO. And I talked about these units that we evaluate, and that's a very good example of practical cooperation. But the other way around, Qatar has offered a lot of their installations and their training institutions and training facilities offered to NATO or NATO allies, nations, to come and train and practice here in Qatar, which is good for NATO or the NATO allies, because it is the circumstances, of course, the weather conditions are different from what we have in Europe, very hot, for example, and it's very good for soldiers to train under different circumstances, under real conditions. And so therefore this is a very generous offer, and of course this is one of the things that I will tell the nations. Their own military representatives have heard it, but I will emphasize it in a letter to the nations after I return, to make sure that all the nations understand that this is a possibility. I also saw, for example, in the Air Force Academy, that there is already a number of allies that train pilots or have pilots here in the academy that are being educated and trained by the Qatar Armed Forces, Qatar Air Force. So I think there's a lot of opportunities. I've seen really, really sophisticated and state-of-the-art, the latest and greatest technology and facilities during my visit. Some are in the final stages of being constructed. But I think those facilities, as offered by the Qatari Armed Forces, are a great opportunity for the allies. And that was the focus of my visit here, to make sure that we not only talk about things, but that we actually walk the talk. And I think that is a great news for us as an alliance, that Qatar is willing to work with us. And we have, let's say, we benefit both from this sort of cooperation.
If you look at what's been happening in Gaza, most recently Lebanon, what is NATO's role in all of that? The world is watching these horrors unfold, and there's a lot of condemnation and concern, but nothing is being done to stop it, and it just escalates, and it keeps escalating. Like, should NATO be playing a bigger role? Can it?
Well, NATO doesn't have a formal role in this conflict between Israel and Hamas on the one hand and Hezbollah on the other hand. But I know a lot of allies are involved in talking to Israel, for example, talking to the nations in the region in order to try to stop the conflict, to protect the people that are being killed on all sides. To make sure the hostages that Hamas has taken are being released, that the attacks on Israel stop, that Israel is living up to the international rules as well. So it has to be a very balanced discussion on both sides of the conflict. And so I know a lot of allies are involved in that, but NATO as an organization is not playing a role. Whether they should play a role is, of course, a political question first and foremost. And that is only possible if all allies, 32, would agree to do that.
Which is complicated.
And I don't think that is at the moment the case.
If you look at what we've seen unfold over the last couple of months, it's the first time ever that we've seen Iran and Israel directly exchange fire. This is a massive change. You were talking about tectonic plates shifting. The Middle East, this has very much been happening. The assassination of Hezbollah Secretary General Hassan Nasrallah, huge implications, certainly for the power politics also of the region. How do you see this play out regionally? Again, allies are involved when it comes to, in their own individual ways. How do you assess what we've been watching playing out, particularly in the region over the last couple of months?
I think both nations, both Israel and Iran, do not have any interest in a direct confrontation in the longer run. I don't think it is in the interest of both nations. But of course, Israel is being attacked by proxies of Iran, particularly Hezbollah from Lebanon. And they want those attacks to stop, and that's why they have interfered. And
I mean, they do say if there's a ceasefire in Gaza, those attacks will stop. So we then enter the political realm. Yes.
So, I mean, militarily, there's a number of things you can say about the conflict. I mean, if a civilian installation becomes a legitimate military target, if, for example, there is a military unit operating from that
But Israel
complex.
says a lot, yeah.
That is international law, and therefore, if that is the case, then it is a legitimate target. The amount of violence or the amount of force that you use is, of course, part of a discussion that can be held, whether it's proportionate or not. But in a certain way, Israel has the right to defend itself against those attacks. And therefore, and they want their hostages back, and all these things are in a way supporting what Israel is doing. Now, the way they do it and the amount of force that they use in the different areas, like in Gaza and Lebanon, that is that is of course part of a discussion that is legitimate as well.
Disproportionate.
And therefore, of course, the civilians that are being killed unnecessarily, that should be avoided at all times. That is also part of international law. So it is a very sensitive discussion, and it's not easy. It's not a black and white discussion. But I think if you look at it, we don't see Israel basically stopping at the moment. And we see that as a result of what Israel has done, of course, in Iran with the killing of the political leader, of Hamas. That is, of course, one of the reasons why Iran now has attacked Israel, and it depends very much on whether they continue to do that back and forth. And in the end, that is not something that most likely will continue endlessly, because it is not necessarily ending the dispute between them. Israel.
There's no military solution.
There's not a military solution between Iran and Israel if the only thing they do is attack targets in each other's nations. They're not direct neighbors, so it's unlikely there will be direct attack on Israel from Iran. That's not possible. So in many ways, it is a situation where both sides at some point need to sit down and talk about that enough is enough.
That's always the way.
And in the end, that's always the way. Yeah.
I want to move north to the Arctic. You've been quite vocal about this. There's a lot playing out there that perhaps many people are not quite aware of. How would you describe what is happening in the Arctic with Russia, with China? Give us a sense of many of us who don't know what's playing out.
Yeah, for many years, the Arctic was seen as an area where there was that should be demilitarized. Unfortunately, we see that Russia is using the area more and more for military bases. And so there is a direct interest to the alliance when it comes to the security of those nations when Russia is militarizing the Arctic. In combination with the effects of climate change, that if the northern route, normally that water was always under ice. It was always
frozen.
ice.
And
it was always frozen,
right?
and therefore inaccessible for shipping. But we now see more often that it is actually navigable, and that ships can go through the ice, still with icebreakers very often. But if the ice is withdrawing more and more, and that northern route becomes an open passage for shipping, economically that is interesting because it's a much shorter route than through the Suez Canal, and let's say the southern route. But of course it has military implications as well if that route opens. For example, the Russian Pacific Fleet could be going to the Atlantic Ocean much easier and faster than now is the case. And unfortunately, we also see that there is, through the growing cooperation between China and Russia, there is more and more cooperation between them in the Arctic as well. China calls itself a near-Arctic state. You need to have a little bit of imagination to say so, but that's what China says. So we see more and more involvement from China with unclear intentions. And therefore, we keep a closer eye on what is happening there.
Admiral Rob Bauer, Chair of NATO's Military Committee, thank you so much for talking to Al Jazeera.
It's been a pleasure.